there are outcomes in life that appear to be shaped by visible factors: effort, discipline, strategy, timing, and opportunity. These elements are often emphasized because they can be measured and observed. They create the impression that results are produced solely by what is done externally. But beneath all of this, there is a deeper layer that quietly determines how these external efforts unfold. It is not immediately visible, yet it consistently influences direction, experience, and sustainability. It is the alignment of the spirit. Because not everything in life responds to effort alone. Some outcomes are drawn by alignment. Some experiences are shaped by internal positioning. Some results flow naturally when the inner state matches the condition required to sustain them. This is why effort alone does not always produce consistent results. Two individuals may apply the same level of discipline, pursue similar paths, and yet experience completely different outcomes. The difference is not always found in what is being done, it is often found in the condition from which it is being done. Internal alignment determines external flow. When alignment is off, even the right actions can feel heavy. Progress may happen, but it feels forced. Results may appear, but they do not last. There is movement, but no continuity. This creates a cycle where effort must constantly increase just to maintain what has already been achieved. But when alignment is correct, something shifts. Effort becomes lighter. Progress becomes more natural. Results begin to stabilize. This is because alignment reduces resistance. And resistance is what makes everything feel difficult. When there is internal conflict between belief and action, expectation and reality, intention and perception, it creates friction. This friction is not always obvious, but it affects how decisions are made, how opportunities are recognized, and how outcomes are sustained. This is why internal positioning matters, because what is happening within influences how everything outside is experienced. If the internal state is unstable, even stable opportunities can feel uncertain. If the internal state is unclear, even clear direction can feel confusing. And if the internal state is misaligned, even correct actions can produce inconsistent results. This is where the concept of positioning becomes important. Positioning is not about external movement, it is about internal readiness. It is the adjustment of awareness, focus, and perception into a state that is capable of receiving and sustaining what is desired. Because not everything can be received in every state. Some things require clarity. Some things require stability. Some things require alignment before they can fully flow. This is why presence and abundance are not only about pursuit, they are about condition. Presence is not something that is chased at, it's something that is recognized when alignment is established. Abundance is not something that is forced at, it's something that flows when resistance is reduced. And both of these respond to positioning. When the internal environment is aligned, presence becomes easier to perceive. It no longer feels distant or occasional. It becomes consistent because awareness is clear enough to recognize it. At the same time, abundance begins to shift from something unpredictable into something structured. It is no longer experienced in fragments or temporary moments. Instead, it begins to flow with continuity because the internal state is no longer creating resistance. This is the difference between chasing and attracting. Chasing requires constant effort because alignment is not established. Attracting happens naturally because the internal state is already aligned with what is being received. This does not mean that action is unnecessary. Action is still required. Effort is still important. Discipline still matters. But without alignment, these become exhausting rather than effective. With alignment, they become purposeful and sustainable. This is why positioning the spirit is essential. It determines whether effort produces stability or just temporary movement. It determines whether opportunities are recognized or overlooked. It determines whether what is gained can be maintained or quickly lost. And most importantly, it determines whether presence and abundance feel distant or naturally integrated into life. Because alignment is not about adding something new, it is about adjusting what already exists so that it can function properly. It is a realignment of focus, a correction of perception, a stabilization of internal state. And once this alignment begins, everything connected to it begins to shift. Decisions become clearer, reactions become calmer, direction becomes more consistent. This is how transformation starts, not externally first, but internally. And once the internal structure is aligned, external experience begins to reflect that alignment over time. This is the invisible factor that determines everything. Not effort alone, not timing alone, not opportunity alone, but the condition from which all of these operate. Because when the spirit is positioned correctly, what once felt difficult begins to feel natural, and what once felt distant begins to move closer without the same resistance. This is the beginning of true alignment. Before anything can be received, there must first be the capacity to receive it. This principle operates quietly but consistently across every area of life. It is not enough for something to be available. It must also be recognized, accepted, and sustained. And recognition depends on the condition of the internal environment. This is where receptivity becomes essential. Receptivity is not passive. It is not the absence of action. It is an intentional state where awareness is clear, distractions are reduced, and internal noise is quieted enough to perceive what is already present but often overlooked. Because not all. Everything that matters arrives with intensity. Some things are subtle. Some things are quiet. Some things require stillness to be noticed. When the internal environment is filled with constant movement, thoughts racing, attention shifting, emotions reacting, it becomes difficult to detect these subtle signals, not because they are absent, but because there is no space to recognize them. This is why many feel disconnected from presence and abundance, even when both may already be near. The issue is not always distance, it is interference. Internal interference. This interference can take many forms. It can appear as constant worry that occupies attention before clarity can form. It can appear as distraction that divides focus into multiple directions, preventing depth in any one area. It can appear as emotional instability that shifts perception from moment to moment, making consistency difficult. And when these forms of interference are present, receptivity weakens. Because clarity requires space. Space to observe without immediate reaction. Space to recognize without distortion. Space to understand without confusion. This is what creating an atmosphere of receptivity means. It is the deliberate reduction of internal noise so that awareness can become sharper. It is the intentional slowing of reactive patterns so that perception can become more accurate. It is the process of making room internally for what is already available externally. Because what is constantly occupied cannot receive clearly. If attention is always engaged with pressure, there is no room for clarity. If the mind is always reacting, there is no stability for recognition. If focus is always scattered, there is no depth for understanding. This is why receptivity must be created, not by removing responsibility, but by managing internal state. It begins with awareness, recognizing where attention is being consumed unnecessarily, recognizing which thoughts are creating noise instead of clarity, or recognizing where emotional reactions are overriding stable perception. Once this awareness is established, adjustment becomes possible. Attention can be redirected. Focus can be simplified. Internal movement can be slowed. And as this happens, something begins to change. Clarity starts to increase. Perception becomes more accurate. Awareness begins to deepen. This is the beginning of receptivity. It is not about forcing understanding, it is about allowing it to emerge. Because when the internal environment is calm and clear, understanding does not need to be chased. It appears naturally. Direction does not need to be forced. It becomes visible. Presence does not need to be searched for. It becomes noticeable. This is how alignment strengthens, through space. Because space allows recognition, and recognition is what connects awareness to reality. This is also where consistency becomes important. Creating an atmosphere of receptivity is not a one-time action. It is a maintained condition. Because the natural tendency of the mind is to return to activity, to fill space, to engage constantly with something. But receptivity requires balance. Not complete stillness, but controlled engagement. Not absence of thought, but clarity of thought. Not removal of responsibility, but alignment of focus. This balance allows awareness to remain active without becoming overwhelmed. And once this balance is established, something begins to stabilize internally. Attention becomes less reactive. Thought becomes more structured. Perception becomes more reliable. This is when receptivity becomes natural rather than forced. And when receptivity is natural, presence is easier to recognize. Because presence is not something that suddenly appears, it is something that is often already there, waiting to be noticed. And when awareness is clear, it no longer feels distant or occasional. It becomes consistent. The same principle applies to abundance. Abundance is not always about sudden increase, or is about sustained flow. And flow requires recognition, acceptance, and proper response. Without receptivity, even available opportunities may go unnoticed or unutilized. But with receptivity, something changes. Opportunities become more visible. Decisions become clearer. Outcomes become more aligned. Because the internal environment is no longer interfering with what is being received. This is the power of creating an atmosphere of receptivity. It does not add something new, it reveals what was already present. It does not force outcomes, it allows them to be recognized and sustained. And once this atmosphere is maintained, alignment becomes stronger, perception becomes clearer. And the experience of presence and abundance begins to feel natural rather than distant. There is a difference between moments of awareness and a lifestyle of alignment. Moments can inspire, motivate, and create temporary clarity, but they do not always produce lasting transformation. Alignment, however, when practiced consistently, begins to reshape internal structure in a way that becomes stable over time. This is where many struggle. They experience brief periods of clarity, moments where everything feels aligned, focused, and connected. In those moments, decisions feel easy, perception feels sharp, and direction feels clear. But when those moments pass, the previous patterns return, and the sense of alignment begins to fade. This happens because consistency has not yet been established. Because what is occasional cannot become structural. Occasional effort may create temporary results. Occasional focus may create brief clarity. Occasional alignment may create short-lived progress. But none of these create stability. Stability is created through repetition. And repetition is what transforms awareness into identity. This is why consistent alignment is more powerful than intense but occasional effort. Intensity can produce quick movement, but without repetition, that movement cannot be or sustained. Consistency, on the other hand, builds gradually, but it creates something far more valuable: internal structure. And structure determines continuity. When alignment becomes consistent, it begins to operate automatically. It no longer requires constant effort to maintain because it has been reinforced enough times to become natural. This is the point where transformation shifts from effort to identity. Because what is repeated becomes familiar. What is familiar becomes comfortable. What is comfortable becomes natural. And what is natural becomes sustained. This is how alignment becomes a lifestyle rather than a moment. It moves from something that is practiced occasionally into something that is lived continuously. And once this shift happens, everything connected to it begins to stabilize. Presence becomes consistent instead of occasional. Clarity becomes reliable instead of temporary. Direction becomes steady instead of uncertain. This is the effect of consistent alignment. Because when internal structure is stable, external experience begins to reflect that stability. Decisions are no longer made from confusion. Reactions are no longer driven by impulse. Focus is no longer scattered across multiple directions. Instead, there is continuity. And continuity is what creates progress. Because progress is not built on isolated moments, it is built on sustained direction over time. And sustained direction is only possible when alignment is consistent. This is also where discipline plays a role, not as restriction, but as reinforcement. Discipline ensures that alignment is maintained even when it does not feel effortless. It ensures that focus is returned even when distraction appears. It ensures that clarity is preserved even when external conditions shift, because external conditions will always change. There will be moments of pressure, moments of uncertainty, moments where distraction increases. But when alignment is consistent, these moments do not have the same disruptive effect. They are processed differently. Instead of breaking focus, they are absorbed into it. Instead of creating confusion, they are understood with clarity. Instead of causing instability, they are managed with structure. This is the strength of consistency. It creates resilience without forcing resistance. Because when alignment is stable, there is no need to fight every disruption. The internal structure is strong enough to remain steady regardless of external variation. This is also what allows abundance to become consistent. Because abundance is not only about receiving, it is about sustaining. And sustainability requires structure. Without consistent alignment, even what is gained can be lost quickly. But with consistent alignment, what is gained becomes integrated into a stable pattern. This is how growth becomes continuous. Not through bursts of effort, but through maintained alignment. And this is what transforms experience over time. What once felt difficult becomes manageable. What once felt inconsistent becomes reliable. What once felt distant becomes integrated. Because alignment is no longer something that comes and goes, it is something that remains.
This is the goal.
Not temporary clarity, but lasting structure. Not occasional progress, but continuous movement. Not brief connection, but sustained presence. And this is only achieved through consistency. Because consistency is what turns alignment into identity. And once alignment becomes identity, everything that flows from it becomes stable, predictable, and sustainable in a way that occasional effort could never produce. There are moments when life feels blocked, not because nothing is available, but because something is resisting what is available. This resistance is not always obvious. It does not always appear as a clear obstacle or a visible barrier. Instead, it exists internally within perception, expectation, belief, and response. And this is what makes it powerful. Because internal resistance does not stop flow completely, it disrupts it. It slows it down, redirects it, or weakens its consistency. It allows progress to happen in fragments instead of continuity. It creates movement but not stability. This is why understanding resistance is essential, because what is not recognized internally cannot be released. Resistance often forms gradually. It can begin with past experiences that shape expectation. When something has not worked before, the mind begins to anticipate similar outcomes. This anticipation creates hesitation, even when new opportunities arise. Not because the opportunity is the same, but because the expectation has been shaped by previous patterns. Over time, this expectation becomes automatic. It influences decisions without being questioned. It affects perception without being noticed. It shapes response without being consciously chosen. This is how resistance operates quietly. It does not need to be strong, it only needs to be consistent. Another form of resistance comes through fear. Not always obvious fear, but subtle forms of it. Fear of instability, fear of loss, fear of change, or even fear of responsibility that comes with growth. These do not always appear clearly, but they influence how opportunities are received. Because receiving something new often requires leaving something familiar. And familiarity, even when limiting, can feel more comfortable than uncertainty. This creates internal conflict, a desire for progress on one side and hesitation on the other. And where there is conflict, there is resistance. This resistance does not always stop movement entirely, but it creates inconsistency. It allows progress to begin, but not to sustain. It allows opportunities to appear, but not to fully develop. This is why flow feels interrupted. Not because it is absent, but because it is being resisted. There is also resistance that comes from over-control. the need to manage every outcome, to predict every result, to ensure that nothing moves beyond expectation. While control can create structure, excessive control can limit flow. It can prevent natural movement, restrict flexibility, and reduce the ability to adapt. Because flow requires allowance, not lack of direction, but openness within direction. And when control becomes rigid, it reduces that openness. This creates tension, and tension reduces flow. This is why removing resistance is not about forcing change, it is about recognizing what is restricting it. Recognition is the first step. Seeing where hesitation exists. Noticing where expectation is limiting perception. Understanding where fear is influencing response. Once recognition happens, something begins to shift, because awareness weakens resistance. What was once automatic becomes visible. What was once hidden becomes understandable. What was once dominant begins to lose its control. This is where release begins, not through force, but through clarity. Because resistance does not need to be fought, it needs to be understood. Once it is understood, it naturally begins to dissolve. The mind no longer holds on to patterns that are clearly seen as limiting. The internal system begins to adjust automatically when awareness is present. And as resistance decreases, flow increases. This is not something that needs to be created. It is something that begins to happen naturally once interference is removed. Because flow is the natural state when alignment is present and resistance is absent. And as flow increases, something changes. Progress becomes smoother. Decisions become easier. Outcomes become more consistent. This is not because effort has increased, but because interference has decreased. This is the key. Many try to increase effort to overcome resistance, but effort does not always remove internal blocks. In some cases, it increases pressure, which creates more tension, which further reduces flow. But when resistance is removed, effort becomes effective. It aligns with movement instead of pushing against it. This is how positioning the spirit reaches a deeper level. Not just through alignment and consistency, but through the removal of what disrupts both. Because alignment creates direction. Consistency creates structure. But removing resistance allows flow. And when all three are present, something powerful happens. Life begins to move with less friction. Opportunities connect more naturally. Outcomes begin to reflect intention more clearly. This is the state where presence becomes continuous and abundance becomes stable. Not because something new has been forced into existence, but because what was already available is no longer being resisted. And once resistance is removed, flow does not need to be pursued, it begins to sustain itself. There comes a point where understanding must move beyond reflection and become daily practice. Because no matter how clear the insight is, no matter how powerful the realization feels in the moment, it cannot transform life unless it is applied consistently. Awareness opens the door, but alignment keeps it open. This is where the shift must happen, from knowing to doing, from occasional alignment to daily positioning, from temporary clarity to sustained structure. Because alignment is not a one-time decision, it is a maintained state. Every day presents new inputs, new pressures, new distractions, and new opportunities. And without consistent alignment, these external factors begin to shape internal state instead of the other way around. When that happens, clarity weakens, focus becomes scattered, and the sense of connection begins to fluctuate. This is why daily alignment is essential, not as a rigid routine, but as a stabilizing practice. A deliberate return to clarity, a consistent adjustment of focus, and a repeated positioning of the internal state towards stability and awareness. Because what is repeated becomes reinforced, and what is reinforced becomes natural. This is how alignment becomes sustainable. It begins with intention, taking time each day to become aware of internal condition. Noticing where attention has drifted, where distraction has taken hold, where resistance may be forming. This awareness is not meant to create pressure, it is meant to create clarity. Because clarity leads to correction. Once awareness is established, alignment can be restored. Attention can be redirected toward what matters. Focus can be simplified into what is essential. Internal noise can be reduced so that perception becomes clear again. This process does not need to be complex. It needs to be consistent, because consistency is what transforms small adjustments into lasting change. A single moment of alignment may feel powerful, but repeated moments of alignment create structure. And structure is what sustains presence and abundance over time. This is also where discipline becomes valuable, not as restriction but as protection. Discipline protects focus from being scattered. It protects clarity from being lost in distraction. It ensures that alignment is maintained even when external conditions shift, because conditions will always change, but alignment must remain stable. This is what creates continuity. When alignment is stable, external changes do not disrupt internal balance. Challenges are processed with clarity instead of confusion. Opportunities are recognized without hesitation. Decisions are made with confidence rather than uncertainty. This is how presence becomes consistent. Not something that appears occasionally, but something that is maintained daily through alignment. And when presence is consistent, something else begins to stabilize abundance. Because abundance is not only about receiving, it is about sustaining. And sustainability requires structure. Without daily alignment, even what is received may feel temporary. But with alignment, what is received becomes integrated into a stable flow. This is the difference between momentary gain and lasting, or provision. And it is determined by consistency. This is why the call is clear. Do not wait for the perfect moment to align, create it daily. Do not rely on occasional clarity, reinforce it consistently. Do not allow distraction to dominate, return to focus intentionally. Because what is aligned daily cannot remain unstable. Each day of alignment strengthens internal structure. Each moment of awareness reinforces clarity. Each return to focus builds continuity. And over time, this continuity becomes identity. Alignment is no longer something that must be remembered, it becomes something that is lived. Presence is no longer something that must be sought, it becomes something that is experienced continuously. Abundance is no longer something that feels uncertain, it becomes something that flows naturally. This is the result of daily positioning. Not sudden transformation, but sustained shift. Not temporary improvement, but lasting stability. And it all begins with a simple but powerful decision to align every day, to maintain focus consistently, to protect internal clarity intentionally. Because when this becomes a practice, something undeniable begins to happen. Life no longer feels forced. Progress no longer feels inconsistent. What once felt distant begins to feel natural and present. This is the outcome of daily alignment. And this is the call: commit to it, maintain it, and allow presence and abundance to become not occasional experiences, but a consistent and unshakable reality.